Okay, so I know that from our assessments of the audience, all of you had a fair bit of comfort with sort of general environmental benefits of soil health, but maybe not as much with assessing soil health. And a lot of you go out there and walk fields and do your easement monitoring. One of the great things you can do while you're out there is just kind of look around. You don't have to have a shovel with you to detect quite some major poor soil health issues, right? If you're walking out there and you're seeing this kind of ponding and rutting after a rainstorm, that's a soil health issue. If somebody has recently plowed and you see clods like this, here's a plowed field, right? This kind of clodding after plowing up is a clear sign that there are soil health issues, because those soils are compacted and they're not even crumbling apart into loose aggregates because they are that hard and that packed together. So there's not enough pore space there, for example, to allow the water in. Sometimes right after some major tillage, disking, harrowing, a soil will get a little bit of a rain. And if those aggregates are falling apart, you'll see all of the little raindrop remains at the surface there, and everything kind of crusts over. Or you can get major, muddy puddles with a crack as it starts to dry up. If you see poor growth, like this is a degraded pasture and you can see everywhere the animals have walked, there are hoof prints in the soil, there's a lot of soil showing. All of those are signs of poor soil health. So as you walk fields, these are ones that you can easily pick up. Now, if you are willing, if you've got the time, it is always really enlightening to bring out a shovel, and we'll talk more about that in the soil health assessment session if you're joining that. Also, you can watch a video from a past session online, and I believe we're going to make these videos available also. So if you are going to the comment session with Rachel, which is also fantastic, then if you missed the soil health assessment session, you will be able to catch up. But if you bring a shovel out, there's a whole lot more that you can do. So for example, stick a shovel in the ground, pop it up, and if horizontal to the ground, you're seeing this kind of parallel cracking, that's a clear sign of compaction in that soil, and it's definitely a soil health issue. You can see that these soils are not very well aggregated. So there's a lot you can see if your eye is just a little bit trained, just walking across the field. I want to spend a few moments talking about how it is that our soils get there, right? Because what is it that we did? How did they get there, right? Why do we have so many degraded soils? It's almost at a point where you can go anywhere and see degraded soil, to the point where we just kind of end up thinking that's the way it is. It is often much harder actually to find healthy soil. But how did they get there? Well, we've been for hundreds of years in this country really disturbing our soils, a lot of tillage, but frankly also a lot of chemical disturbance. We don't have in conventional systems a lot of soil cover. We tend to harvest much of our crop. We tend to till the soils, putting any of the residues back under the soil, back into the soil, and so now we don't have it on the soil surface protecting the soil. There's not a lot of rooting going on in soils except for a few months in the middle of the growing season, if what we're doing is growing one crop only, right? So that example of a corn crop gets planted in April. By the time June comes around, you have some pretty vigorous rooting, right? That crop is knee-high or hopefully a little bit more, and you're starting to really fill that soil with roots. Now those plants are feeding the soil microbes with that one crop. And then that crop grows really vigorously June, July, August, September, and then it senesces. So in a corn system, for most of the year, you don't really have a lot of rooting in that soil. And we don't have a lot of biodiversity in our soils. And diversity is really key to resilience, and it's one of the core issues that we need to work on in our agriculture. So what all of that does, as we lose our biodiversity, rooting, soil cover, as we increase our disturbance, we end up losing a lot of soil organic matter because we're breaking up those aggregates, we're exposing those aggregates to the air. We're often bringing soils up from below to the surface where it tends to be warmer, where there tends to be more impact of water. And so we're losing a lot of that organic matter. And therefore, we're also getting more erosion. Most of the organic matter tends to be at the surface. So if you get erosion, that means you're losing most of the organic matter that way. And we tend to also get a lot of compaction. And similarly, that causes erosion and loss of organic matter, because once your soils are compacted, the water is not going in. And that means that the force of that water is pulling that soil off the field. So then we get decreases in biological activity. And as Doug was just talking about in a fair bit of detail, right, aggregate stability is all about biological activity. Those biota build the house, right? All those organisms we looked at earlier in that food web, they are all involved in building aggregation in the soil. And you need those biological glues that come out of plant roots, out of fungal hyphae, out of various bacteria, various other organisms that are in the soil. They create glues and they pack those aggregates together. Fungal hyphae and roots hold those aggregates together, and they get stuck and turn that stable if they are not disturbed, and if all of those biological organisms continue to work on building them, right? You can kind of think of it as our sand, silt, and clay particles that make up soil are bricks, and they need to be stuck together with mortar. If you don't have that mortar, those biological glues, we're not going to be able to create that aggregate stability. So then if your aggregate stability decreases, as you just saw in those demonstrations, right, we get more crusting, we get more surface compaction, we get less infiltration, we get less drainage of water through the whole soil profile. It also means we're recharging the groundwater less. We get more erosion, and then we lose even more organic matter. Our nutrients tend to be lost to whatever body of water that we're then having water quality concerns with. Same with the topsoil, which is the best part that we should be growing in. And we get more ponding and yet less water storage, right? We get that ponding, then we get some runoff. We're just not storing enough water across the whole agricultural landscape, because a lot of soils are at least a little bit sloped, right? And then we lose nutrient availability, right? Because physically the soil is really hard for roots to get into. It's not taking in enough water, and the way that roots take up nutrients is through the water in which those nutrients are dissolved. We get more pests and disease because those plants are stressed. And with that, crop yields and crop consistency decline. And so farm economic viability declines. And while in this country, we can just throw a lot more money at our farm fields and, you know, buy more inputs, buy more irrigation, buy more pesticides, in a lot of the world globally, these kinds of issues lead to hunger and malnutrition. So that's the downward spiral of soil degradation, and that's what we need to turn around. So for the whole country, we can say, okay, there are 4 soil health management principles that we can put out there. And those 4 principles, if we can bring all of those 4 principles into our production systems in the way that they fit, we can resolve a lot of these issues. Those 4 principles are to minimize disturbance, maximize soil cover, maximize biodiversity, and maximize continuous living roots. I would say that those 4 principles can be applied to any system across the globe. But of course, there are caveats, right? You can always find some kind of exception. You can always find some kind of, wait, but what if that? So they're very broad and flexible principles, and they need to be adapted. And they're not the only thing, right? There's still nutrient management, there's still pest management, there's still appropriate use of technology. And we have to put all of that into context for any given production system. So adopting these 4 principles is, you know, you can broadly understand how those principles help our systems work better, but to really apply them on a given farm takes that conversation with the producer, takes a lot of learning, and takes figuring out which practices we use given the production system to address those principles, to achieve a system in which all of those 4 principles are met. So there's a lot of adaptation. The rubber hits the road on the farm where all of those principles are adapted in a way that successfully works for that system. Those principles are basically in place because we need to care for our below ground livestock the same way we do for our above ground livestock. So those of you who have worked with a lot of producers that are just crop producers, one of the ways you might catch their attention is, did you know that you're a livestock producer? And they'll say, what? What are you even talking about, right? Because every farmer, and you, if you have any garden, if you have a pot in your living room with a plant in it, you know, arguably we can say all of us produce livestock, and those livestock are below ground. And those biota have two needs. They need a home that is protected, that has structure, that has water, that has air, that has nutrients, that has the energy that they need to take in. And we need to feed that below ground life, right? They have to have their protected home, and they need to have the food, the energy that they need accessible in that home. And they need a diverse year-round diet. How do we achieve a year-round diet in systems that only grow plants for part of the year? It's pretty tricky. It's limiting, right? Because of course, some of that organic matter remains behind. Those microbes are still eating throughout the year. You'll hear some people say some pretty extreme things like, oh, all the microbes get killed and the soil is dead after X, Y, and Z practice. And that's not true. Biota are pretty resilient. There's always going to be something still alive. But for that system to be highly functioning, we really need to protect their home and feed those below ground livestock with ideally a more diverse diet. And that's where we get really excellent soil function. So the soil health principles support high functioning soil by doing those two things. Maximizing living roots and maximizing diversity feeds diverse continuous inputs to those underground livestock, right? Carbon sources, energy, nutrients, all of those stimulate diversity, break disease cycles, increase soil organic matter and nutrient cycling, enhance plant growth, and increase beneficials, right? This is where we're feeding those microbes. Minimizing disturbance and maximizing soil cover protects the habitat, protects the aggregates, it protects the structure of the soil, it balances out water and air and temperature so that we can maintain soil organic matter in those aggregates and reduce erosion and runoff risks so that we can maintain that very nice home that they're in with buffer temperature. You know, we can reduce evaporation, we can make sure there's enough drainage so that the microbes are neither in saturated conditions nor in very dry conditions. So those are the basics of why those principles matter. If you're the kind of person that likes to really critically evaluate something, you know, say, well, there's some overlap, right? Because minimizing disturbance, we're also going to feed our livestock more because that stuff's still going to be around. Maximizing cover, we're growing some cover crop roots and some cover crops in part to do that, and they also provide some of these nutrients, right? So again, it's not a perfect analogy, but overall conceptualizing why do these principles matter? What do they do? Here's a good way to think about that in very broad terms. So I hope that that's helpful. So I'm going to speed up a little bit because I do want to give Michelle and Ben a little bit of time at the end to introduce their aspects of the barriers. So we'll talk a bit about soil health management systems and practices, and then we'll talk a bit about barriers, and then I will hand over to Michelle and Ben, hopefully with a few minutes to spare before hopefully the platform does not kick us out. So what is a soil health management system? A soil health management system we defined at NRCS while I was there as a collection of management practices that focuses on increasing soil carbon levels and improving or regenerating soil health by addressing all 4 soil health management systems principles. So what that means is we can look at each of those principles and say, okay, do we have practices in place that address that principle? And ideally, in a number of these cases, multiple practices. So with a production system, often there's a focus on a particular practice, right? These days, a lot of folks talk about cover crops. Cover crops are fantastic. We want to get more cover crops in the ground. If we had something growing in every field all around the year on every single field that was otherwise bare, we would be making a lot of progress. But cover crops are not the only way to do that, right? Sometimes those folks who get into biochar start thinking, oh, well, biochar is the solution to all problems and just everybody apply biochar and we'll be good. No. No one practice is going to do it all. And actually, we get the best synergies of practices when we apply all of the principles, when we combine multiple practices, adapt them to each other successfully within that system so that it really works out. So that takes quite some doing. And what I'm going to do here today is, at least for those of you who are not familiar, make you aware of a number of practices that are out there and how those could be, which ones of those address which principles. There's a lot more to this. So it's going to give you hopefully a working understanding of at least some of the language, the practices that are out there, the practice standards that NRCS has, so that you are more equipped to keep reading about it, to keep learning more, to work with partners that you may point your producers to if they are interested in adapting these practices. First, an example though. Those soil health management principles, do they work? What do we get? Well, we can actually look in a number of places across the Midwest. There's often a lot of aerial photography available. A lot of farmers have yield monitors, so you can really start to look at the benefits of soil health. Here's an example of a field that's got this very interesting, very straight green strip. I mean, there's some variability throughout the field because that just happens, different soil types, different management, topography, all that. But here's a very straight strip. What is that? Well, when you look at the field maps from some time back, it turns out this used to be a fence row. Fence rows tend to have perennial grasses and various different plants, not just grasses even, grasses, legumes, forbs, all diversely growing perennially around the year, right? So we're maximizing biodiversity, we're maximizing cover, we're maximizing living roots. Fence rows don't tend to be plowed up, we're minimizing disturbance. So fence rows are often some of the last remaining places in ag where there's all soil health management principles in effect. And when those fence rows get plowed up, for a few years, you got a yield bump and more resilience right there where that soil health, soil function was built up. Now, the great thing is we can actually expand that influence across whole fields. So here's side by side a field of a producer who's got all soil health management systems principles in place. Next to same soil type, a field of a producer who is just managing very conventionally. And that particular year with a lot of rain, you can really see the impact of that management difference. We see differences like that across the country and across the world. When folks manage with all principles, when they really adapt that system, there's a lot of success to be gained. So how do we do that? We'll just go through a few of those practices. First, in terms of protecting habitat for the below ground livestock, minimizing disturbance, maximizing cover. How do we minimize disturbance and why minimize disturbance? So first, a bit about the types of disturbance that are common in agriculture. The one that we're most aware of generally is physical disturbance, whether that is from tillage, from grazing compaction, or heavy equipment traffic. All of those are major physical disturbance that can really damage soil health. Chemical disturbances are pretty real too, though. Fertilizers, pesticides, soil amendments can be chemical disturbances, especially if they are not adapted properly for that situation. And some of them really would be better off minimized if we have alternate options. And then biological disturbances, right? Grazing can be really beneficial for the soil or can be really detrimental depending on how it's done. Non-grazing for certain systems can be detrimental. Fallowed system, whereby I mean bare fallow where there's nothing growing. Monocultural systems, those are all biological disturbances. And so the effects of excessive or chronic disturbance are basically that we're losing the quality of the habitat for soil organisms, and we're often losing soil structure. So what are some of the practices we can put in place? Each of these, you'll notice that each practice that I'm naming here has a code. And if you are interested in learning more, you can go to the NRCS website, and I'm realizing we don't have that link, so I'll post that link in the chat afterwards. There are all of these practices are defined nationally, and then each state has their own practice standard version that is adapted for that state for each of these practices at NRCS. So that's what those numbers are indicative of. They're all NRCS conservation practice standard codes. so that you can look up the most recent practice standard. So residue and tillage management is the NRCSEs for no-till or reduced till. When we reduce our tillage, that really decreases disturbance. Conservation cover is basically perennial cover of soil. Nutrient management is a great way to reduce chemical disturbance. Integrated pest management is a great way to decrease chemical disturbance. Prescribed grazing, a way to improve grazing, so there's less of a disturbance from that. So all of those practices are ways to minimize disturbance. When we come to tillage, you know, when we look at, for example, soil respiration in a conventional tillage system, here's the tillage event. There's a whole lot of loss of organic matter, and then overall there's less respiration. We can measure less CO2 coming off over the rest of the year, basically because there's not as much microbial activity that is needed for nutrient cycling precisely during this part of the year where the plants are growing so actively. In no-till systems, things tend to be a little more balanced out over the course of the year. Maximizing soil cover. Why do we need to maximize soil cover? Well, if the soil is covered, we don't get as much erosion. We also tend to get a lot more infiltration, because when a raindrop hits the soil, if there's a growing cover, a live root kind of cover, there's actually a channel right there from the surface, that leaf right into the root. That is a channel right into the soil that water can flow along, and pores tend to be better protected. They remain open when there's protection on the surface, so we get better infiltration. We tend to get less evaporation because the surface gets less hot. We therefore, we moderate soil temperature because, again, the surface is covered, so there's a bit of an insulating barrier there. And that makes for much better habitat for those soil organisms. Food for biota tends to be increased when we maximize soil cover also, so there's sort of that interplay between both feeding and maintaining the habitat for organisms. And we can mitigate compaction from machines and livestock much better when the soil is well covered. We get a lot more compaction. It's a lot harder to get into a field that doesn't have soil cover than it is when a field is nicely covered like this one here. So what practices maximize soil cover? Cover crop is a great one. Cover crop, as of last time I looked, was the most funded practice at NRCS these days. A lot of people are getting really excited about it, but not all cover crops can be planted through NRCS dollars. There's just simply not enough dollars there. I think even with the increased funding now, there's still not going to be enough. And so we have to find multiple ways to get farmers to adopt cover crops, and we'll talk more about that. And in particular, showing that there's an economic benefit of cover cropping is something that we're making a lot of progress with. Residue and tillage management, again, reduced tillage really maximizes soil cover because we're not putting that residue into the soil, we're leaving it right there on the surface. Conservation cover, mulching, controlled traffic, forage and biomass planting, and prescribed grazing. All of those practices will help maintain surface cover and give us all of those great benefits. When it comes to feeding the below ground livestock, we're looking at maximizing living roots, maximizing diversity. And so, okay, how do we do that? And what practices? So you'll keep seeing cover crop coming up in every single one of those. And that's because cover crops do a whole lot of really fantastic things for maintaining good soil function. So how do we maximize the presence of living roots, right? Oops, sorry about that. Growing crops or cover crops in and off season, right? So we really want to grow something living, something green for as much of the year as possible. We really want to avoid bare fallow kind of situations, whether it's all year or whether it's over the winter. I think really if there was one way to encapsulate all of the principles and you just wanted to tell a farmer one thing, it would be grow something alive in your soil year round. At all times, you always want to have green cover. Now that's trickier in places where we have winter, but a lot of things overwinter, right? So we want something live growing there year round, if at all possible. And we recognize it's not possible in all systems. And this is where the adaptive context-based approach to this comes in. We need to find ways to make it work. Increasing the time that perennial crops are in the system. wherever that's an option, we really want to explore that. And managing rotations, figuring out whether there are intercrop mixtures that can be planted, managing forage height so that there's good living roots around the year. All of those are approaches. And then the practices, again, with NRCS codes, we can look at conservation crop rotation, conservation cover crop, forage and biomass planting, and prescribed grazing. Maximizing biodiversity, again, how do we do that? And what practices? So we really want more diversity in our agricultural systems, and especially in the Midwest where we have a lot of corn and soybean. Any way that we can increase the diversity, whether it is through a cover crop, whether it is through integrating livestock back into those systems. These days, there are some pretty exciting groups out there, like the Savannah Institute is really helping folks adapt agroforestry to their situations. There's a host of ways to diversify, and we still need to work on the markets. That's one of the barriers that we'll talk about. But we really need more diversity in our systems. So growing diverse cover crops and legumes, increasing diversity of crop rotations and mixtures, integrating livestock and grazing cover crops, increasing the time in diverse perennial crops. Those are all ways to do that. And again, the NRCS practices here, you'll see cover crop is in the list. Also conservation crop rotation, conservation cover, forage and biomass planting, integrated pest management, prescribed grazing, and soil carbon amendment, which is a new interim practices that's been around for several years. And 336 will be the code once that is finalized. It was on the Federal Register, but it's taking them some time to actually finalize and make that formal. But soil carbon amendment is the practice standard for the practice that will allow NRCS to provide financial assistance and technical assistance for applying compost, biochar, mixtures of compost and biochar, and other carbon amendments that can help improve soil health. So just, collage of some of those pictures, some of those practices, right? Here's a colleague of mine, Doran Cox, who is roller crimping some very tall rye on this farm. A nice way to get some really nice soil cover down, have those living roots in the soil right up until a crop is planted, right into that rolled crop. Here is some zone tillage equipment, right? You can, instead of totally stopping tillage, you can just till up a zone, loosen up just where those roots are going to go, till up just a small strip here so that you can plant the seed right into that, but maintain cover on most of the soil. Here's some high clearance equipment that's being used for cover crop interseeding and side dressing nitrogen at the same time. So you can actually get nitrogen and a cover crop into a standing corn crop. At the time that you would side dress, you can adapt that side dress time a lot better, how much nitrogen you're going to apply. Really great way to make sure to not put up a bunch of nitrous oxide when there's too much nitrogen in the field, and get a cover crop growing at the same time that will then remain behind in the fall and continue to grow so that you don't have a bare field. Here's a great mix of cover crop, triticale and winter peas in this case. And here's some prescribed grazing style, lots of cows and some pretty tall crops that they're grazing, rotated between smaller pastures for better soil health. So lots of options. There's lots to learn. We could spend days on this kind of stuff. And there's a lot of materials out there. And I bet you've got a lot of partners in your state who provide assistance to producers. Couple of words about pasture management. I think grazing and animal agriculture have really gotten a bad rap. There are some great realities. It takes a lot of energy and nutrients and cropland to feed a lot of animals. We have some thinking to do about that, but overall, yes, we can absolutely do a lot of damage to soils if we graze poorly. Here's some very compacted soil and poorly growing soils there. We can get uneven fertility, we can get poor productivity, we can get compaction and erosion problems, weed pressure, poor quality pasture species. All of those are a reality with poor grazing. But also, when you build a good grazing management system that has an adaptive multi-paddock type of system where animals move through small paddocks and you can control a lot better how much they're grazing at any given time, you can actually really rebuild soil health and sequester a lot of carbon. And I'm excited that we're going to get into that a whole lot over the next few years. So a lot of benefits can be gained from grazing appropriately. And that's as much as I'll say about that right now. So overall, we're looking for a win-win for soil health management systems that become commonplace so that we can turn that spiral I showed you earlier around. We want to go to implementing those practices so that we can increase our organic carbon again. We can reduce crusting and compaction. We can improve biological activity and aggregation. We can improve infiltration and drainage. We can reduce erosion and ponding. We can get our nutrient cycling again, get better pest suppression. We can reduce our inputs. We can improve the resilience of field conditions and therefore the consistency and predictability of crops. And so with really well adapted systems, we can increase crop yield, quality, and consistency. We can increase farm economic viability and resilience and a host of environmental benefits. So really exciting opportunities, but there's a lot of work to be done, and we need to work across all of our organizations to help our farmers adopt these practices. So we have about 20 minutes in this session. I would love to have some time to discuss some of those things, but also there's the barrier session. So I don't want to, I think maybe we have a short, are there any key questions that we want to discuss? And then I'll spend a few minutes on barriers. I'll turn over to Michelle and Ben. Do we have any questions in the chat?
I'm not, Bianca, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat.
Okay. Any comments from anyone? I think I'll guide us on to the barriers discussion. And I think that we need to take a bit more time, maybe in the review session tomorrow, we can discuss more some of the barriers. We can discuss those as we do our practice runs in some pitching so that we can have some discussion around that. I think this is where the crux of it is, right? There's a lot of barriers to soil health adoption, and we're all going to run into them as we work with producers on adopting soil health practices. Adopting soil health practices is tricky because it really takes reframing our understanding of the system. It requires understanding the physical resource and the biological resource that we have and how that interacts with the production system. But then on top of that, layered in with it all is the fact that every farm is an economic entity, right? This is the livelihood of the producer. They need to continue to make money, and making change can be risky. So how do we help our farmers address that risk? How do we help them be successful sooner rather than later with their new systems? That's a key piece. And then of course there are social barriers, right? Social considerations, because who wants to be the strange one, right? The odd one where people drive by that field and say, what's that person doing? Jeez, you know? And that's a reality for many farmers out there. So awareness and understanding of key human, social, and economic considerations is very real in terms of implementing and getting to that long-term adoption. We can think of adoption as being along a spectrum where right now we've got a lot of innovators across the country, and you are very likely to have some innovators in your state who have been doing these practices for decades, who are wildly successful with them, many of whom may be really good communicators and may be very open to taking on mentees and helping them adapt too, because a lot of these farmers who are innovators are really excited about what they're doing and really want to share their information. Then we generally have early adopters that look at what the innovators do and say, yeah, those innovators have made it happen. They experimented, they've failed, they're willing to share some of their failures. I can learn from them. Okay, I'm ready to adopt. And then we've got sort of the early majority, the late majority, and then those laggards. There's always going to be a few people that don't adopt that new technology. You know, there are still some folks out there that don't have cell phones, but most of us have cell phones by now. I bet that wasn't the case 20 years ago. And so I'm hoping that soil health adoption goes the way of cell phones over the next few years, and that we go from where we just have, you know, some innovators and some early adopters by now and get all the way to, you know, maybe most of the way through that late majority and get everybody to adopt. It's going to take some work, right? Because those farmers need to go through building initial awareness of the practice. I'd say we're there for a lot of farmers. A lot of farmers have at least heard of soil health, heard of cover cropping, heard somebody say that it's a good thing. But then they have to actually take interest, and they have to start looking at, well, how is it that I might do this? Would this work for me? You know, can I try it out maybe on a field? And that's often what I suggest when a producer expresses interest, is willing to start evaluating the information. They're up for trying it. A great low risk way is to take one field and try something new and watch how it goes. And if it's a problem, make sure to keep up with it, make sure to keep going, but find some mentors, find some resources you can turn to help troubleshoot so that you can improve it on other fields, so that you can get all the way to adoption. So just a bit of a list, right? Here are all of the different ways that we can get hampered in our soil health adoption transition. That paradigm shift, I would say that's the initial thing that needs to happen, right? People need to realize, oh, here's something that is really promising. I understand why I would adopt it. I get that it will be better for me. Now it's a matter of actually doing it. But then there are a whole lot of logistical barriers. Once we're past sort of the initial mental barrier of making a change and taking interest in it, there are things that get in the way, like lack of land tenure and perception. You know, when somebody stops tilling in an area where everybody else tills, you've all heard of the clean tilled field. You've probably all heard of trash being referred to as, you know, residue in the field is referred to as trash in the field. There's a lot of language out there that is indicative of our perception of these practices, and clean tilled and tilling under the trash is part of it, right? Having a messy cover crop out there when you're used to having a clean tilled field, that, you know, that perception, even once a farmer is there and understanding why to adopt, they might still be hampered by the perception by their landlord or by the perception of the community, right? Is that community supportive? Do they have the economic support to start getting into this? Are there miscommunications out there? You know, there are things out there like what was mentioned today, right? We need some mythbusters. Don't go burn all your cover crop residue or all your corn residue thinking that you're going to create biochar. There are a lot of misconceptions out there, and addressing those, making sure that farmers have access to good information is key. Recovering from failures when they happen, right? If you try something out and it really fails, are you going to go back and do it again, right? So that's where it's a really good idea to make sure that somebody trying things new either is doing it on a field, recognizing it might not work the first time and willing to try again, or that they're paired with somebody who has done it and who can consult with them and help them do it right the first time so that they don't have to put up with that failure. Risk aversion is very real, right? It can be risky. You plant a cover crop and it rains all spring and you plan to till it under and now you can't. Okay, now what do you do with it? If you have the option to go in and herbicide it, that's one way that you can handle it, but it can be tricky. Technical understanding, right? All of the soil and plant processes and how to really manage that is tricky. How to adopt successfully in a way that it really fits into that producer's context, that producer's production system, so that you can get the crop rotation adjusted, so that you can get the right kind of cover crop planted at the right time in the right way, managed throughout the season, terminated appropriately, managing pests and nutrients differently, integrating livestock with that. These can be some pretty tricky things to figure out. And so often farmers need technical assistance to be able to get there. And then finally, financially, you know, often new equipment is involved, and Michelle and Ben will talk about some of the financial realities, so I won't get into the depths of that. So there are some solutions, right? We've talked about mentors and developing mentoring groups, really having some of those innovators available in a community, developing cohorts and peer-to-peer networks. technical assistance networks, financial assistance networks. We'll talk a lot during this course about how to connect farmers with those resources in your community so that they have the help that they need. Really training farmers on the benefits and the agronomic skills and knowledge to be able to make that transition in a successful way. I want to make sure to give a little bit of time to Michelle and Ben to get going, and I want to just take a moment here to see if there are any questions, any thoughts on the perception of soil health in your community and particular barriers that you encounter. Anybody want to share particular barriers? What are you most grappling with?
I would just say, don't go ahead, Landon. Of course, I'm going to fight with my coworker over time to talk.
I think one thing that I've really struggled with, especially as I've just gotten into the most recent years of my career, Bianca, has been when the straight cut economic benefits laid out on a silver platter seem to not move the needle. That's my one thing, if I had to pick one.
Hopefully Michelle and Ben will really be able to help address that one.
I was just going to say time. I mean, I think we need to remember that all these things take time and we get one chance a year. And so just being really, I don't know, I mean, we need to be patient and just work with people and be there. Like, I can't stress enough what it takes to get these things going. I work with a lot of farmers that are using a lot of these practices. And that is what I do all day, every day, as I answer phone calls. I ride around in the tractor. I'm just constantly there to make sure that they have, because the second you walk away and they have a question and they don't have an answer, like, there it goes. And there's your trust and there's your reputation. So it's just really important to be patient and to be available.
And if you're not the person that does that, if you're in an easement entity whose job that isn't, finding some of the entities in your state that do that and building those connections so that you can send growers their way so that they do have that support is one thing that I think we'll talk a lot more about.
I see one of the barriers in our community is the size of fields keep increasing, and of course then the tree lines all go. And I've had two of my neighbors rip out all the tree lines, which one tree line benefited me, but the trees were on his side and he removed them all. So it's hard to, as I tell people the importance of these trees, they all say, but I can't get my tractor through, or, I got to go big. And that's a hard argument to win.
It is definitely a tough climate to do that in. And yet it's, even just the effect of those trees for pest suppression, it's hard to understate how much pests will travel. And when we've got corn, all we need to see is the COVID of corn hitting, and where's our corn crop going to go, right? And if we can avoid some of that, a lot of these pathogens travel on the wind. You get that breeze flowing across multiple fields, and there they all go, versus having that tree line to at least catch some of that, having some diverse fields in between. So, but yeah, it's a real issue out there. Brian's got his hand raised. Go ahead, Brian. You're on mute.
Got it. Thank you. Some of the barriers I've heard some of our farm tenants share is, access to equipment, especially no-till equipment. They just don't have that, or they have to find it to rent it. But another barrier I think that is probably a bigger deal to most farmers anymore, at least that we deal with, they depend so much on co-ops to help manage their chemical application, their fertilizer application. And so, you know, to do some of this, you really need to think. It's not normal, what they're used to, and they've got to be flexible, and they've got to be responsive. And if they're depending on the co-op that is literally covering, you know, tens of thousands of acres, they can't be quite that responsive. And so that's a challenge for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where really working with those co-ops to help them understand the importance of soil health and help them build into their business model a way to help farmers with that. I think that's where a lot of the change in the Midwest is going to happen. So hopefully we can help make some change through some of the climate smart commodity partnerships over the coming years. We'll be working with Truterra to hopefully model that, part of Land O'Lakes. And so, you know, helping build some models where those co-ops are fully on board with making soil health happen. Hopefully we can address some of those issues.